Let's get started. Hello, everyone. We're delighted to have James Robinson today in the audience, and we are starting another academic year with Polycon UK webinars. James, you have about 50 minutes for the talk. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you. Welcome. Greetings from Chicago. So I'm going to talk about a project I'm very passionate about. I've been working on it I started working on this project in 2011, 2012, when I was on sabbatical in Bogota. And it's with a whole, Angélica Bautista, who's a collaborator of mine, who's a colleague at the Harris School, Juan Sebastián Galán, who's at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Rafael Torres, who's now a pre-doc here at the University of Chicago, and my long-standing collaborator Ragnar Torvik at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. So I'll give you the big kind of pitch and then talk about the details. So here's the motivating quote: "A community is controlled with fear or dreams," and this is in a book about a particular paramilitary bloc, the Heroes of Granada. Okay, so this project is sort of using the experience of Colombian paramilitarism to look at some big questions in social science that I've been interested in for many years. And I think the way to think about that is, if we think about experiences of comparative development, comparative economic growth in particular, or comparative public policy, the way we tend to think about that is in terms of institutional variation explains incentives and public policy choices and growth experiences. So I've done a lot of research on that, but I've done so much research on it. I know that the R squared of these institutional theories is not one. Maybe we can't measure things properly, or there's informal institutions, et cetera. But my current feeling would be there's a lot of variation in these growth experiences that can't be obviously explained by institutions. Whatever it was that induced Deng Xiaoping to do what he did, or Lee Kuan Yew, or what is inducing Paul Kagame in Rwanda to do what he's doing at the moment, it seems unlikely that it could be thought of as institutions in the kind of normal way. All right. So how do we think about this variation that's not explained by institutions? And I think that's really what this project is about. Okay. And why study Colombian paramilitarism as a way of doing this? Well, because I realized when I was on sabbatical in Bogota that these paramilitary groups all demobilized in 2005, 2006. I'll tell you more about the details, but there's 34 large blocks. And within the blocks, there were multiple fronts, about 150 fronts. They mostly demobilized, not all of them, but mostly they demobilized in 2005, 2006. And they went into a transitional justice process. And I realized that transitional justice process was kind of generating an enormous amount of information about how these groups operated. And how is this relevant to the motivation? Well, these commanders, as we'll discuss, commanders of these fronts in particular, were very autonomous. Okay, they might have created institutions, but the types of strategies they adopted were not really constrained by institutions. And there was huge variation. So to us, it just seemed like this was the perfect kind of context to think about these issues. So here's a quote, a sarcastic quote from a famous, quite famous in Colombia, or infamous perhaps, Commander Ernesto Baez. That's an alias. How could a small independent state work inside a lawful state such as ours? So the small independent state is Puerto Boyacá. Here it is. Welcome to Puerto Boyacá, land of peace and progress. We'll see if that's true. The anti-subversive capital of Colombia, and it still is today, by the way. Okay, so these paramilitary commanders often referred to their organization as states. Okay, so I've talked about this work in terms of states, but political scientists immediately get hung up on things like sovereignty and things like that. But you're economists, so you're not going to get hung up on sovereignty. And okay, and I'm not going to talk about them as states, okay. All right. So these paramilitary groups, hundreds of these what was their motivation? So I want to say, we discuss this a lot in the paper because there's a huge amount of qualitative evidence on this by Colombian scholars. That this was basically a kind of ideological movement. Okay, so if you look at the history of these paramilitary groups, and the main hypothesis that I'm going to advance to explain the variation actually comes from fieldwork and actually talking to these paramilitary commanders, but their motivation was to fight against these Marxist guerrilla groups. So there were these two big Marxist guerrilla groups, the FARC that have basically demobilized now, and the ELN that are still fighting. And the personal history of most of these commanders is through kind of relatives being kidnapped. I'll show you some descriptive statistics on that. People being harassed. The one group that we did a lot of work with, for example, they started in 1977. The FARC opened a front in the east of the department of Antioquia. They started kidnapping ranchers, started shaking them down for what's called la vacuna, the vaccination in Colombia. You need to vaccinate yourself by paying, otherwise you get kidnapped, the vaccination for, and they just they'd had enough. So 10 of them got together. They formed a group called Los Escopeteros, like the shotgunners. They got 10 shotguns. They went up in the mountain and they started ambushing the FARC and stealing their guns and ammunition. And that story is pretty typical. Okay, so think of the motivation as really ideological, fighting against the FARC, fighting against these Marxist guerrilla groups, but trying to control population and territory. Think about that poster I showed you, the anti-subversive capital of Colombia. Okay, so when you talk about Colombia, people usually think, oh, this has got to be about drugs. Okay, so here's the way to think about drugs. We spent a lot of time discussing this in the paper. Drugs has been the big thing, in rural Colombia since the 1970s. Okay, so of course, these guys ended up controlling half the country. So of course they got into coca production and coca shipment and stuff like that. But I would say, that's not what's driving it. That's just how you make money in rural Colombia. That doesn't imply that that's what's motivating the whole thing. And we spend a lot of time in the paper trying to show that this is not confounding the results. Okay, so, all right. Good. So the motivations were very similar across these different commanders, but they used very different strategies. And we can look at all sorts of things, but what the paper focuses on, hence the title, is dreams. What do I mean by dreams? Well, what that paramilitary meant, he meant public goods. He means trying to give people what they want, trying to raise their standard of living, okay? Providing public goods, roads, schools, houses for poor people, bull rings, etc., okay? But of course, they also used fear. They used violence. They used terror. They massacred people. So the focus is going to be on trying to explain the covariation, if you like, of fear and dreams as strategies to control population. Okay. So what would be a hypothesis to kind of explain this variation? And so we have real data, I'll show you in the paper. But as I said, this hypothesis originally came from just talking to these people, like getting them to think about the variation and asking them, like, how would you think about that? And, and it turns out, perhaps this is what people always do, I don't know, but it turns out when you get these commanders to start talking about that, they always, in our experience, they came up with these stories of like socialization, basically, like, oh, this person, his father was a bodyguard for that guy. He grew up around guns and violence. He has no principles, and the word that came up time and time again was campesino. Like campesino is a word, which translates best as peasant. Okay, so peasant, thanks, I think, mostly to Monty Python's Flying Circus, has this sort of derogatory, meaning in English. Like if you say someone's a peasant, it's like an insult in England, But all I can say is that campesino, is not an insult in Colombia. And in fact, people wear the identity of campesino with pride. Even elites, they'll put like a ruana, which is like this blanket, like campesino wear. They put ruana. President Uribe, he had a ruana over his shoulders to show, yo soy campesino, like I'm a campesino too. Like I'm I'm someone with principles, and so I think this is really about, you know, what is it about being a campesino that matters? And I think the way we're going to think about this is really it's about social preferences, that campesinos have particular social preferences, and in particular, more specifically, reciprocal preferences. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, you know, here's a definition from Falcon Fischbacher. You know, people are reciprocal if they reward kind actions and punish unkind ones. So remember, we're going to try to explain the covariation of public good provision and violence. Okay, so people are reciprocal if they reward kind actions and punish unkind ones. So the way we're going to conceptualize this covariation is sort of, you know, I'm a commander, I'm going to try to control a region, try to control people. So I can provide public goods to them, but in exchange, they need to contribute. And if they don't contribute, I'm going to punish them. And it's that punishing that we're going to interpret as violence. Okay, so we develop a model. It's all in the appendix. There's too much to talk about, you know, and but the model's in the appendix. I'm not going to go through the model. So if I go through the model, I have no chance of ever explaining the kind of getting to the empirics, which I think is the main thing. So I'm just going to try to explain the intuition. It's a very simple model of reciprocity where I give you something, you know, if you reciprocate, I get utility from that. And if you're a reciprocator, you get utility from reciprocating. And if you're not a reciprocator, you don't. Okay, so the idea is going to be campesinos have these particular types of social preferences whereby in the context of the model, they provide public goods in exchange for contributions. If they don't get the contributions, then they punish people. And that's going to predict that public good provision should actually go along with violence. Okay, so they should be positively correlated. Okay, so they're not a kind of, you might think that's a sort of substitute, you know, fear, hence the title of the paper, you know, fear and dreams, not fear or dreams. Okay, so we developed this model. I think the main thing is, you know, we've been working for years now, kind of putting together this basically all this data from this transitional justice. Why did this paper take us so long to write? Well, because when I was there doing fieldwork on sabbatical in 2011, 2012, the transitional justice process was kind of in full swing. So we could go to these courts in Bogota and like listen to these people giving testimony, but we had to wait till the whole thing converged and all the documents were out in order to kind of put the data together, basically. So it's been super frustrating, but finally, I'm still alive and we managed to do it. Okay, so we could put this data set together, sort of documenting how these different groups kind of operated over time, trying to capture the different characteristics of these commanders. And then we're going to test this hypothesis that what's explaining the variation is really the kind of identity of the commanders of these paramilitary groups. We're going to test that with a spatial regression discontinuity design. Okay, now what we find is that peasant commanders provide much more likely to provide public goods. They provide more public goods. They're much more likely to commit violence. Okay, and let me sort of be more specific about violence. But when I say violence, the data we have are on massacres. Okay, so in Colombia, they're very good at collecting data on massacres in Colombia and violence in general. Massacre is four or more people killed in the same place on the same day. Okay, why 4? I don't know. That's just how they measure it in Colombia. Okay, so why focus on massacres? I think there's 2 reasons for that. There's a kind of intellectual reason and there's a practical reason. The intellectual reason is the model sort of predicts kind of collective violence, meaning I'm a paramilitary commander, I'm going to provide public goods in exchange for contributions. Okay, so if you're not we're going to look at the part of the parameter space where if you're not a reciprocator, you don't want to reciprocate the provision of public goods. And if I catch you, then I'm going to punish you. So the model actually predicts sort of collective violence. So I think that's the intellectual argument for doing that. The more practical argument is, yeah, there's lots of assassinations as well, but 2 things about assassinations. First of all, it's very difficult to kind of attribute assassinations to a particular paramilitary group. So here, you know, we want to know who committed that massacre, all right? So assassinations, very difficult to do that. It's also very difficult to know where people were assassinated. So massacres, we tend to know the location with kind of quite a lot of certainty. Assassinations, people are killed here, they're dumped, their body is dumped in a river, it's dumped, you know. So we played with that, but I think there's two, you know, I kind of outlined why we're focusing on massacres. Okay, so we don't see fear or dreams, we see fear and dreams. Okay, and I think that's interesting. Okay, I claim. All right, there's a lot of literature. I'm not going to talk about that. If somebody wants to ask me a question, they can go for it. All right. So just to say a little bit about Colombian paramilitarism, you know, it really goes back to the 1960s, or 1970s. Like I gave you that example of the shotgunners from 1977. It starts kind of gaining momentum. And we look at the period after 1997. So this gentleman here with his, he's got the AUC on the back of his shirt. That's an organization, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, that was started in 1997 by these Castaño brothers, the three Castaño brothers, who were some of the great kind of entrepreneurs of Colombian paramilitarism. That was a sort of umbrella organization, that kind of coordinated many of these paramilitary groups throughout the entire country. And we're going to look at basically between 1997 and 2005-06, when the paramilitaries demobilized. So that's the period where we have much better data and where the transitional justice documents sort of collected, kind of much more comprehensive data. There is much more historical stuff, but which we're playing with, but this is where we are at the moment. Okay, so just to give you some kind of feel of like how these groups were everywhere at the time they demobilized, so we're going to look 1997, 2006. You can kind of see here the different colors are the different blocks, and the gray. I'll show you a clearer picture to distinguish like fronts headed by a peasant and those not, by a campesino and those not. But you can sort of see these kind of paramilitary blocks and fronts are kind of all over Colombia. It's sort of, they were just everywhere at this time. And then in 2005-06, President Uribe, managed to persuade these guys to kind of demobilize. Okay, so I put this picture up here because, if you're Colombian, especially this guy here, with the mustache, that guy is Don Berna. He was a big time kind of drug dealer, a member of the Medellin drug cartel. He got into paramilitarism as a kind of cover, for his drug business. So not to say drugs didn't go on, it did go on, but that's not the story. Okay, so there's a lot of variation in paramilitary strategies. This is what I got so excited about. There were stories in the newspapers, when I was there. So that's when we started investigating. This is just from some field work we did. Here's a school, just to give you, I show these just because the first time I tried to talk about this at lunch, at the university, I said like, oh, did you read that article in El Tiempo about the paramilitaries building roads and stuff like that? And everyone's reaction was, oh, bullshit. No paramilitary ever did that. And was like, so I called up this journalist friend of mine and I said like, Maria Teresa, like, what's this story? Do you believe that? And she was like, I don't know. Let's go see. So here's what we saw. Here's a school. Here, this is going through the middle. This is a road. You might ask how they managed to build roads. Well, they stole all the equipment in Medellin, and they got someone to explain the human capital of building roads. Here's a health clinic in Sonson that was built by the paramilitaries. So this is all for real. We interviewed, the doctors and people here. These are houses for poor people. But of course, without getting too excited about the public good provision, there's a lot of killing as well. Okay, so it's those things, we're trying to put together in this paper. Okay, so here's what a paramilitary group kind of looks like, or a block. So this is a block. This is the this is the Autodefensas Campesinas, the peasant self-defense forces of the Magdalena Medio. Here's the boss, Ramon Izaza, alias Patron, which is actually quite significant. If you're thinking about social preferences and reciprocity, he's the Patron. That has a particular meaning, especially in rural Colombia. And this is a block made up of 6 fronts. So he was in charge of the Frente Central. And here's a bunch of other people, his commanders, who shall I talk about? On the right, we have Magiva, like they all have these aliases. Magiva, that's the Frente Jose Luis Zuluaga. So he's Luis Eduardo Zuluaga. The front was named after his brother who was kidnapped and killed by the ELN, by one of these Marxist guerrilla groups. He was married to Isaza's daughter, you know. This guy, Frente John Isaza, Ovidio Isaza Gomez, that's one of Isaza's sons. This guy, nicknamed Terror, I don't think that needs translation, is another son of Oliverio, another son of Isaza. So a lot of people had relatives, and I think that's the next project. We have all the data on who hired relatives and all of this, but just to give you a sense of like what these groups look like, and here's like some of the mug shots of the commanders. Okay. I'm not going to go into that. So what we have in the appendix, we have a lot of case study information. So if any of you are interested, if you read Spanish and you're interested in Colombian paramilitarism, there's this astonishing project called the Grupo de Memoria Histórica, which was started about 15 years ago, which has now produced about 50 books on the conflict in Colombia with incredible amount of case study information. So there's a very kind of serious and deep Colombian literature, also scholars at CINEP, the Institute CINEP. So there's a lot of, we in the appendix, we look a lot of the case study information on campesinos, the relationship between campesinos, social background of commanders and their kind of behavior just based on like qualitative information. But here's something we can say a little bit more systematic about the relationship between campesino and preferences. So we use a political culture survey from the National Statistical Institute in Colombia from 2021, where they use these questions about positive and negative reciprocity. So these kind of canonical questions about, do you return a favor? Do you give a gift to a stranger, who helps you? Are you willing to punish someone who's, unfair towards you, etc.? So these canonical questions about positive reciprocity, negative reciprocity. So what we have in this data is, we have this data kind of mapped to the municipal level in the survey, so we can operationalize our definition of campesino. So how are we going to measure campesino? Well, we try different strategies to do this, from the CVs and the autobiographies or whatever. But in the end, the thing that was sort of cleanest and, we could implement for the biggest sample was just looking at where people were born and saying, you're a campesino. Campesino is something connected with rural, agrarian upbringing. So we're going to say you're a campesino if you're born in a municipality where at least 50% of the people live in rural area. Okay, so we can take that definition, we can kind of map it onto this survey, and we can look for the differences between campesino and non-campesino in the micro data. And what you can see in this, from this data is campesinos are significantly more reciprocal, both in the positive and negative sense. So, here's some real data on campesinos and reciprocity. Okay, all right. So the model, I'm not going to tell you, I'm just going to give you the kind of intuition of the model. There's two sorts of people. There's reciprocal people. So there's these people with these reciprocal preferences. So you just model reciprocity kind of in the utility function. If you give me something, I get utility from reciprocating. There's reciprocal people and there's non-reciprocal people. Okay. And there's peasants and non-peasants. And in the baseline model, peasants are more likely to be reciprocal. And the intuition for that is, reciprocity is sort of good collectively, could be good collectively, but an individual can benefit from being non-reciprocal. Okay, you give me something, I don't give you anything back. So in the baseline model, we just take it as given that this is just exogenous. Peasants are more likely to be reciprocal than non-peasants. And in the appendix, it's all in the appendix, but then in extension to the model, we kind of endogenize that through a Bécin-Verdier type mechanism of endogenous preference evolution. And the intuition is just, in a campesino community, in a peasant community, which the sociologists call a closed corporate community, if you deviate, you're more likely to be identified and kind of ostracized or punished. Okay, so that's the kind of key exogenous parameter, the ease with which you can detect someone who doesn't reciprocate. So then in the Bissin-Verdier model, you know, that gives you an endogenous steady state where peasants are more likely to be reciprocal. In the baseline model, we just take that as exogenous, and then there's this campesino community, non-campesino community. Campesinos are more likely to be reciprocal. I pick a commander, you know, I pick someone at random to try to start a paramilitary group. Okay, it's not obviously paramilitary commanders are not chosen at random, and I have a lot to say about that. So there's a lot of discussion of that in the paper, like how do you become a paramilitary commander, just in case you get bored of your academic career, you know, like how do you become a paramilitary? How would I go down that? Anyway, I'm kidding, but like so obviously that's the issue of selection, and I'll talk a lot about that when I get to the empirics. But this is just to sort of say, you know, based on, you know, what we know, it's not very likely that these people were chosen based on the characteristics of these communities. Okay, so someone becomes a, you know, you're chosen to become a paramilitary commander, you can start a group. So like entry is going to be important. And when you start a group, you can choose different strategies. Okay, and we look at a very simple case where we look at part of the parameter space where if you're reciprocal, you offer public goods. In exchange, people in the population who are reciprocators give you contribution. The other people deviate, and if you detect them, you punish them. Okay, so you find paramilitary commanders who are reciprocators provide public goods, and if they detect people not contributing, they punish them. Okay, so what about non-reciprocators? Well, non-reciprocators don't get utility from punishing. Okay, so remember the Falcon-Fischbacher definition, like, you know, reciprocators, they give something, you know, but they get mad if you don't give back. Okay, so basically we look at subgame perfect equilibria where if you're a paramilitary commander that doesn't have reciprocal preferences, basically ex post you can't credibly punish. Punishing is costly. So for it to be credible to punish people who don't contribute, you know, you have to be a reciprocator, because otherwise it's not going to be subgame perfect to actually punish when punishing is costly. Okay, so in that equilibrium, that all unravels, and given that you can't credibly punish people who deviate, it's not going to be worth providing public goods in the first place. So we look at a part of the parameter space where reciprocal commanders provide public goods and they punish people who deviate, and non-reciprocal ones basically don't do either. Okay, but given the assumption about the distribution of preferences, the model implies that a campesino, a peasant commander, is more likely to provide goods and massacre people. Okay, now your reaction to that could be, well, you know, okay, but isn't that a bit sort of trivial? You know, like as my thesis advisor would have said, like, well, the assumptions are very close to the results. Maybe. I think we found it very useful just in terms of kind of structuring the research. But here's two implications of the model that we can test that are pretty surprising. At least we hadn't really thought it through before we wrote it down. One is, it's not enough that on average, peasant commanders provide more public goods and are more likely to commit a massacre. They're more likely to provide public goods and more likely to massacre. It has to be the same commander that provides the public goods and commits the massacre. Okay, so that's an implication of the model. We can look at that. Okay, the second thing is also, you know, in the model, you're providing public goods. Okay, so it turns out the utility you're providing to citizens, present commanders basically provide more utility to citizens. So I mentioned you have to decide there's a kind of fixed cost of entry, but then there's also an exit. So I didn't say that yet, but we kind of say, you know, after you've chosen public goods or whatever, then there's a sort of contest with the Marxist guerrilla groups. So the Marxist guerrilla groups are providing some fixed level of expected utility. There's some sort of shock. And so that generates some probability of kind of staying in control, which is increasing in the amount of utility you provide to people. Okay, so it turns out campesino commanders are more likely to enter and they're less likely to get kicked out of power. So that means there's a prediction on the duration of the front, and including on entry and exit. So that we can test in the data also. All right, so, okay. So let me tell you more about the data. mostly the data comes from this demobilization, this peace and justice, neither peace nor justice, peace and justice. There's 146 fronts demobilized, but in the end, we end up using 72 fronts from 23 different blocks, just because information is incomplete. Even in all the thousands and tens of thousands of pages of judicial documents, there's some things we're not just too incomplete to use. Okay, so here's an example. This is from a sentence of a gentleman called Ramiro Vanoi Murillo, alias Coco Vanoi. So he was also El Patron. He was the commander of a block, the Bloque Mineros, which is like north of Medellin. And so just to give you a sense, he was born in Llano Mateo in Yacopi, Cundinamarca. So here's a sort of something interesting, which is you might think, okay, if I'm going to explain variation in public good provision, then if someone's a local, they're more likely to provide public goods. So we can test that. Okay, so here's this guy ended up in Antioquia, in the north of Antioquia. He's from Cundinamarca. He's not a local. Okay, but in fact, our model, if you think about our model, if you thought about the Bissin and Verdier model, you acquire your preferences when you're young, and you could move from Yacopi, to Taraza, where he ended up. And you take your preferences with you. And so that actually, our model sort of says it shouldn't really matter, whether you're a local or not. You take your preferences wherever you go. And, so we can test that, and it tells you here, you can see, he grew up in a humble family with low economic and educational levels. What did he used to do? Well, he worked as a muleteer, as a butcher, and he bet on cocks. He bet in cockfighting. That's a good profession in rural Colombia. Okay, so et cetera. Okay, so here's evidence from the court documents about what Ramiro Vanoi Murillo did. He built 2 clinics in the Clínica Nueva Luz and the Clínica San Martín, and here is one of them. I showed you a clinic in Sonson. This is a different one in the north of Antioquia. So just to show, the trial records collect a huge amount of information about these kind of public goods that these commanders kind of provided. Okay, so what about massacres? People have used data on kind of killing and massacres in Colombia before, but at the municipal level. But what we wanted to do was really work at the kind of we wanted to work at a much lower level of aggregation. So below the municipal level, the lowest level is the kind of called a vereda in Colombia. So we took this data. This is from the Noche Niebla, which is the publication of this institute called CINEP, Night and Fog. Kind of, it goes back to the Nazis, but I won't go into that. Yeah. So, so here's the, this is a paramilitary group of the Llanos, the Fuerzas Unidas Campesinas de los Llanos Orientales. They went into a vereda, Puerto Oriente. So these typically has the vereda, and they killed 11 people, lista en mano, like, so with a list of people, so this is a targeted, they had a list of people's names and they killed them, so this is to say, lots of awful stuff went on in Colombia, and it's still going on actually, but just to say, here's a kind of targeted massacre of people by this group in this vereda. So we kind of recoded all this information at the vereda level, because that just gives us a lot more variation to look at. Okay, and there's all sorts of other information we put together, that I won't going to go through in detail. Okay, so here's, where we end up. This is a bit easier to understand than the previous map that I showed you, which is the green, that beautiful green color, are territories controlled by peasant commanders over this period, 1997-2006. So one question is, like, didn't these people get killed, or didn't they have multiple commanders? And the answer to that is sort of yes. And what we ended up doing was basically kind of dropping. There's not that many, it turns out. So I think the first order fact is that most of these fronts had one commander. In some cases, it was a little vague, like who was the commander or what, and then we just dropped those observations. Okay, one thing we could do actually is we should have a balance table looking at, we ended up with these 72 fronts. We started with 146. We should have a balance table looking at how do these 72 fronts look like compared to the ones we ended up kind of dropping because the information was complete. We do have some information on them, so we could do that. All right, but this is the kind of bigger picture, and what we're going to do is use these boundaries. Okay, so we discussed that quite a lot in the paper, like where did these boundaries come from, who determined the boundaries. But let me just start talking about the commanders, because you're going to be most interested in, oh gosh, I'm going to run out of time also. So let me say, without starting to talk about the numbers, just like the raw, here's the peasant. So we end up with 37 peasant commanders and 35 non-peasant commanders. And you can see this is looking at the back. Panel B is like looking at the boundary. So we're going to zoom in on the boundary, of course, to do regression discontinuity design. So you can see here that here is like 30% of these commanders provided public goods. These are peasants, 9% of non-peasants, but 41% committed massacres as opposed to 23. So just in the raw data, peasants are much more likely to provide public goods and much more likely to commit massacres, but the fronts are also significantly longer. So you can see it's almost like it's getting on for 20% higher duration. Okay, so we know a lot about the background of these guys. Were they criminals? Were they involved in the drug industry? Did they used to be in the army? What was their level of education? And in particular, how did they become paramilitary commanders? Okay, so I think like the biggest selection issue is going to be, okay, we could look at the boundary and we could sort of say, okay, fine. So the identification assumption is, no selective sorting, or there could be unobservables, but as long as the unobservables vary smoothly at the boundary, we can estimate the local average treatment effect. But you might say, okay, I can show you balance at the boundary on observables, but like the commander's not being chosen based on the characteristics at the boundary. What about the whole front? So then we show balance at the level of the whole front. But I think here's the more convincing argument that we make in the paper, which is that we know a lot about the history of these guys. How did they be? And they're all guys. They're all men, by the way. If you go down within the groups, there's lots of women. There's lots of women sub-commanders, and there's lots of women in the paramilitaries. But at the top, they're all men. Okay, so how did you become a paramilitary commander? I think like what we show in the appendix, there's a lot of discussion, is there's very, very little evidence that people were kind of selected because of the characteristics, or because of the kind of, there's a particular job to do in this territory. This guy, he's the guy for this job. Okay, so that would be the thing you're worried about, that you're a campesino, you're better at providing public goods. Oh, public goods are incredibly valuable here because there's very few of them. So that we can look at observables and we can look at balance, and we do that. Okay, but you might worry about stuff we can't observe, things that affect who's going to be chosen and affect the kind of incentives or the ability to provide public goods or whatever. So, but I think what's interesting there, as I said, when you look at the histories of these people, how do you get to become a paramilitary commander? You develop trust, basically, like friends, relatives of the block. So typically these front commanders were chosen by a block commander. So relatives, you saw that with the Magdalena Medio people, friends, people who are trusted. That guy, Gurre, I didn't talk about Gurre, which means armadillo. He used to be the bodyguard of Ramon y Saza. So like they knew him, he was part of the family, they trusted him, so like personal characteristics. In fact, many of the campesinos are described as, I don't think I even have the stuff here. Actually, I don't even have the table, but many of them are described as, trustworthy friends. They have experience. They have different types of skills, management skills, like they're good at financial management. A lot of them had military skills also. Okay, so they used to be in the army. None of the campesinos had ever been an army officer, but non-campesinos had been army officers. So of course, we can control for all of that, and I can show you some specifications where we can kind of control for those characteristics econometrically. But what I liked, what we discussed in the paper is that, the way these people seem to have been selected makes it very difficult to believe there's some unobservable at the front level, which is kind of biasing, which is jumping discontinuously at the boundary, which is going to create bias in the estimated coefficient. So that's okay. So we can talk about, so here's the model, it's a very canonical regression discontinuity type of format. We're mostly interested in, public goods, in massacres, and the coefficient of interest is gamma, which is just it's a peasant as a dummy variable, which is 1 if you have a peasant commander of front F, and we have different covariates, and we model the running variable in different ways. Okay, so I talked a little bit about selection. Here's a discussion of etc. Okay, so we can do lots of balance in different ways. Here's the thing that I'm kind of most interested in if you start thinking about selection. For example, in the model, campesinos are better at fighting. Why? Because they can provide public goods credibly. That gets people on their side. They have a better chance of defeating the FARC in the model. So you might think, this is like pre-treatment measure of FARC, not just FARC, but FARC and ELN presence. Okay, so you might think again, well, I'm worried that if I saw kind of lack of balance on this, meaning imagine the guerrilla were like stronger in a particular place, then I'd want to put like a campesino because that person would be better at fighting them. All right, so that's why, just to kind of say, well, that's something that I'm interested in, like looking at balance on. So this is pre-existing presence of the guerrilla. This is again from the same kind of data source on, Noche Niebla and CINEP. Again, public good provision, it's good to kind of show balance on public good provision because, public goods are very scarce. Campesinos can like credibly promise to provide public goods. You might think, okay, he's going to have a lot of traction in this place where the marginal utility of public goods is high, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so there's lots of balance, and we do all sorts of things in the paper. Also, I'm not going to go into it, but some of these speak to kind of big ideas in political science about, especially there's a very interesting literature which was started by Stathis Kalivas about variation in violence towards civilians, Jeremy Weinstein, Laia Baisel's work. Okay. We can do that too, but okay. Commander selection, I talked about that. Again, we have a lot of information, but let me get to the regressions because okay. So the baseline model is just, kind of make this a dummy variable. So like public good, the dependent variable is like public good equals 1 if you get a public good, in Vereda V, so rural neighborhood V, Vereda V, in the bandwidth in municipality M in front F. Okay, so what we did with this, actually it still works, but what we did with this, a lot of people gave us the comment that, well, but public goods, think about that health clinic I showed you, in Sonson. Well, people from all over the municipality in some sense could come to that health clinic, all those roads, or, like they're not very specific to a vereda. So it doesn't make much sense to code the clinica, just to that one particular vereda. So we ended up there basically coding that to the entire municipal level, just, because it seemed to be the right thing to do. We could do it at the vereda level. Also, massacre is just at the vereda level. Okay, so I showed you that data from Noche Niebla. Typically we know how many people were killed. So the baseline model, we just do like massacre is a kind of 1 if there was a massacre, 0 otherwise. But in the appendix, we also look at, we could do the number of massacres. We could do like a count variable. We could do the number of people who were killed. I showed you there were 11 people killed in that massacre. Okay, so it's very robust to that. And then we can look at duration, as I said. So here's the basic kind of regression with public goods on the left-hand side, and the kind of coefficient of interest. And you can see here, like, here's the mean of the dependent variable. So this is a sort of 150% increase in the likelihood. You think of this as a, so this is a one. The left-hand side is a dummy variable. The right-hand side is a dummy variable. So the peasant is a dummy variable. So it's a sort of 150% increase in the probability of getting a public good public goods being provided if you have a peasant commander. So it's pretty big, it's pretty big quantitatively, but if from the descriptive statistics, you see it's a pretty big distinction. And this is like just using different models for the running variable. Here's number 6. Here's the example. Here's the specification I like a lot, which was with block fixed effects. So if I just use the variation within a block, the coefficient goes down, and but it's still there. Just to kind of say, there's a lot of idiosyncratic variation at the level of these commanders. You might think, well, these blocks, isn't it the block commander that's going to really decide strategy? And the answer is no. There's a lot of these things are very decentralized, and there was a lot of scope for choosing different strategies. Okay, so this is the basic public good model, and there's the nice regression discontinuity plot. This is massacres on the left-hand side, the kind of dummy variable. You can see here it's sort of like 100% increase in the probability of committing a massacre if you have a campesino. So this is not a story of like good guys provide public goods, bad guys massacres. Not at all. They go together. And here's what that looks like. This is the duration. These are the duration results. So campesino, and this is all driven by entry that we show. Kind of exit is sort of truncated by this collective demobilization. So this is really, there's a kind of staggered entry. That's what drives this these duration results. And let me just show you a little bit. That's cool. Let me show you a little bit, like, is this confounded by other things? So you might think, well, a campesino is a sort of package. Maybe campesinos are like, they're from rural areas, they're less educated, they're less likely to go, to be in the military. Perhaps this is all just being confounded by the fact that they're less educated or whatever, or they used to, they were not in the military, etc. So some of these things are and some of these things are of independent interest, okay? Like, for example, here's whether they were a local. So now we code whether the front they were commanding includes the municipality where they were born. And you can see that local is actually big and positive in terms of public good provision, and quantitatively large, actually. But it doesn't confound our effect. I think that's mostly what we're interested in. So, my colleague Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, for example, who studied the kind of emergence of, state-like behavior in these guerrilla groups in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, all his results are driven by like local militias, like the people who are become more kind of state-like, or what he calls a stationary bandit, are the locals. Okay, so that, it turns out to be good to have a local, at least, if you're interested in public goods, but it doesn't confound our effect. Okay, and that's true with more or less everything here. Drug dealing, everyone loves this example of Pablo Escobar. He built houses for poor people and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, he did, but maybe that's not the systematic pattern. We find that somebody who was convicted, who has a conviction, there's this from the court documents, has a conviction for being involved in some way in the drug business, actually is less likely to provide public goods. Okay, and we can also look at massacres. Interestingly enough, being a local seems to have no effect on the probability of committing massacres. And again, a lot of these results are of independent interest, but I'm just kind of rushing through them, because I wanted to leave time for questions. Okay, so there's a lot you could say about all of this. I could say, to go back to education doesn't seem to really do much. I think this is something we were kind of very interested in with respect to public goods, but this is whether or not you finish high school. More educated commanders do seem to be less likely to commit massacres. More educated, less massacres. Okay. Here's the, and this is the basically this, this is not a causal. This is just, is it the same blocks that committed massacres and provided public goods? And the answer is yes. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to just sort of back out and say one last thing, which is, what can you take away from this? There's too much about Colombia. Like, I think here's what you could take away. Like, what is it that's driving, Paul Kagame? Lots of things, maybe, but I guess the takeaway here is to sort of say, like, Jones and Olkin have this famous paper, about leadership and growth, and exogenous leader transitions lead to big changes in the growth trajectory in countries? Like, what is it that drives that? So you could sort of say, well, maybe it's something about their preferences, which sounds completely tautological or trivial or something. But here we can put a bit more structure on what type of preferences might be associated with particular strategies, the adoption of particular strategies, and how that could map into something observable in terms of your kind of social background. Okay, so I think there is some sort of general lesson here, hopefully backing away from all the details of the Colombian experience. And with that thought.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, James. There are some questions in the chat, so maybe we can start with that. Orkun, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, thanks, James. It's a great presentation. Lots of things to learn. I was wondering, so you show this correlation between the public good provision and also the massacres, and I was thinking of if the relationship could be kind of like inverse. So if the being able to do massacres would also give you more resources that you can use to provide public goods, is that a possibility in this context?
Yeah, I didn't talk too much about resources. So, so where did they get the money to provide public goods? Well, they basically taxed everybody. They taxed drug cartels. There's a big illegal gasoline trade in Colombia. So the national oil company Ecopetrol has these pipelines everywhere. So they used to smash these pipelines and steal the petrol. There's also lots of petrol smuggled from Venezuela. So there's this thing called the Cartel de Gasolina. So they taxed that. And so that's, they taxed and they shook down businesses. They shook down businesses to get concrete and just basically, make a contribution. So I think, most of the people who are being killed are like, not wealthy enough to kind of for that to generate revenues. The revenues are coming from big landowners, they're coming from businesses, they're coming from, drug dealers and things like that. We know a lot about the composition of finances for some of the blocks, but other blocks, it was never really reconstructed. So I doubt that's the mechanism that's driving it.
Thanks.
Shiwai, you want to go next?
Sure. So thank you for your presentation. So actually, I have two questions. So the first question is whether you can distinguish which between the public goods provision and massacre mainly drives the longer duration of power in your study. And the second question is, so what is the reason of the termination of power? Is it mainly due to the uprising within the front following a massacre, or is it because of conflicts between fronts? And whether the shorter duration of power is good or bad? I mean, if the switch of powers is because of peaceful passing over power, probably it's a better result of longer duration. So I'm interested in your interpretation of this.
Yeah. So as I mentioned sort of briefly, like what's driving the duration is kind of entry. So there's a sort of staggered, like these groups enter in some places earlier than others. There's less variation in the model has a prediction about exit, but of course, since this kind of coordinated collective demobilization, it's all kind of truncated. So that's what's driving the duration results, which is the exit. Is the entry. I mean, that's an interesting question in the sense of I don't think we've looked at that. Like whether if I looked at duration and then I kind of estimated a model with public goods and massacres on the right, it sounds horribly unidentified. We've just kind of run, maybe that's the reduced, I mean, we've run the kind of we could do that, some sort of mediation. It's a good idea. We haven't done that. Yeah, we haven't, I haven't done that. We've been kind of doing the reduced form, I guess. I think I would say, these guys were doing lots of other things, so they were taxing, they were like regulating, You know, like those guys I showed you, you know, they had a radio station, they gave out medals, and they solved disputes like every Friday in this town, Sonson. You know, they would sit in the town square and people would come and complain about this, and they basically solved land disputes and marriage disputes and property, you know, like, so they did a lot of stuff, you know, which was much more difficult to measure than the public goods and the massacres. But we could look at that. It's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question, but maybe if someone else in the audience has one, they can go before me.
I have a question about something that hasn't been mentioned at all, which is there any impact of foreign actors here? So FARC is a Marxist movement, so I guess, I don't know, there is some, but are these fronts really organic local, or has there been any maybe Cuban influence, Soviet Union in the older days influence, American, I don't know.
I mean, FARC and ELN, you know, ELN was founded by a bunch of liberation theologists in the 1960s. You know, in Colombia, they call them sacerdotes con armas, you know, like priests with guns. Maybe in the 1960s, back in the 1960s, you know, but I think it's a very organic Colombian thing. You know, in fact, you know, one thing, if you look at this peace agreement with the FARC, for example, and you look at like the negotiations in Cuba, a lot of it is so completely Colombian, you know. So, for example, the FARC and the ELN were never in favor of like nationalization of land and creation of collective agriculture. It's land to the camp, like in Cuba, like it's like land to the campesino, like the campesinos wanted land. So there's a lot of very Colombian elements to the kind of policy proposal. I think with the paramilitaries, you know, there's actually a famous case of Israelis coming. You know, there are connections between the FARC and the IRA, for example. You know, 4 IRA people like 20 years ago were arrested in Colombia, who'd basically been in Colombia, you know, telling the FARC how to use weapons and stuff. Like, how on earth these people can know each other, I don't know, you know, but there's bits and pieces like that. And there was actually some Israelis who came and helped in this one base. There's a whole book about this guy called Yair Klein, who helped paramilitaries kind of, you know, use weapons and stuff. But it's pretty marginal. I think the first order thing would be to think of this as, you know, a very Colombian thing. You know, you have to think like there's a very deep history in Colombia of this kind of stuff. You know, like I'll give you an example. There's a recent paper in the American Economic Review, a beautiful paper by Diego Ramos Toro, who's a economist at Dartmouth now. And he collected data in this municipality called Agua de Dios. So if you look at his paper, look at the map of Agua de Dios, and like he collects data in these 2 municipalities next to Agua de Dios, and not this other one called Nilo. So he doesn't say why he didn't collect data in Nilo, but I know. Nilo is a República Independiente, meaning it's basically been independent since the 1930s. Like the government doesn't control Nilo. Like you can't go there. Like if you try to go to Nilo, there'd be like blockades at the, you know, they just like self-mobilize. They have guns. You don't go there. They do, you know, that's all over Colombia. So I think there's a long, and that's today. I'm saying today, you know, this is not some crazy thing in the 1960s or like the 19th century. That's today in Colombia. You can't go to Nilo. So I think that's the way to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, so nothing worrying about the econometric exercise in particular. So
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, there are things like I said, you know, but I think it's small.
Thanks. Maybe I can go for one. So I was thinking about the public goods in general, that public goods are non-excludable and non-rival. But in this case, violence can be used to exclude people from accessing health clinics and schools. So how should we really think about saying what is a public good and what is not?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, we have these very concrete examples of public goods, health clinics, schools, you know, recreational facilities. We have some results in the appendix where we kind of break it down. You know, I mean, we're a bit underpowered, but we can look at that. You know, I mean, yeah, I don't know, like in the model, you know, if I, you know, like you can enjoy the public goods, and then if I catch you, you know, not contributing, I punish you. So you're still getting utility from the public good. If I could use violence I'd have to think that through. Like we could think about Like, what if I could use violence to exclude you from the public good so you couldn't enjoy it? We could think that through. I mean, my guess would be there's some set of assumptions I can come up with where the results go through. I mean, I want to add, we're looking at a very specific piece of the parameter space in the model to start with, right? So just to make things kind of clean, this type of commander can commit and the other one can't. And, so we're not, I don't know, we're not, I think it's just a way of organizing the data. I don't know. I don't want to say we're testing the model, that would be a big claim, So I think that's an interesting mechanism. We should think through that. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Discuss it.
Can stop the recording now. The clock's there.